Before I go on to talk about my involvement in public matters under this new governor, it might be a good idea to explain how I became known for my scientific work. In 1746, when I was in Boston, I met a Dr. Spence who had recently arrived from Scotland. He showed me some experiments with electricity. He didn't do them perfectly because he wasn't very skilled, but since the topic was completely new to me, I was both surprised and pleased. Soon after I got back to Philadelphia, our library company received a gift from Mr. P. Collinson, who was a member of the Royal Society of London. It was a glass tube, along with some instructions on how to use it for these kinds of experiments. I jumped at the chance to try out what I'd seen in Boston, and with a lot of practice, I got really good at doing those experiments, as well as others we heard about from England, and I even came up with some new ones. I say a lot of practice because for a while my house was always packed with people who came to see these amazing new things. To share the load a bit among my friends, I had several similar tubes made at our glass factory, and my friends got their own. So eventually we had a few people performing the experiments. The main one among them was Mr. Kinnersley, a clever neighbor who was out of work. I encouraged him to start showing the experiments for money, and I wrote 2 lectures for him. In these lectures, the experiments were arranged in a specific order, with explanations given in a way that helped people understand the next one. He got some fancy equipment for this, where all the small devices I had crudely put together for myself were expertly made by professional instrument makers. His lectures were popular, and people really enjoyed them. After a while, he traveled through the colonies, showing them in every major town and earning some money. However, in the West Indies, it was hard to do the experiments because the air was generally so humid. Since we were grateful to Mr. Collinson for the tube and everything, I felt he should know how well we were doing with it, so I wrote him several letters describing our experiments. He had them read at the Royal Society, but at first they didn't think my work was important enough to be published in their official papers. I sent one paper, which I'd written for Mr. Kinnersley, about how lightning and electricity are the same, to Dr. Mitchell, a friend of mine and also a member of that society. He wrote back saying it had been read, but the experts just laughed at it. However, when the papers were shown to Dr. Fothergill, he thought they were too important to be ignored and suggested they be printed. Mr. Collinson then offered them to be published in his Gentleman's Magazine, but he decided to print them as a separate pamphlet instead, and Dr. Fothergill wrote the introduction. It seems Cave made a good business decision because with the extra material that came in later, they grew into a large book that went through 5 editions, and he didn't have to pay me anything for the content. Still, it took a while for those papers to get much attention in England. But then, a copy of them ended up with Count de Buffon, a philosopher who was rightly very famous in France, and actually all over Europe. He convinced Monsieur Dalibard to translate them into French, and they were published in Paris. This publication upset Abbé Noyer, who taught natural philosophy to the royal family and was a skilled experimenter. He had developed and published his own theory of electricity, which was very popular at the time. At first, he couldn't believe that such a work came from America. He claimed it must have been made up by his enemies in Paris to discredit his own ideas. Later, after he was convinced that someone named Franklin actually existed in Philadelphia, which he had doubted, he wrote and published a book of letters, mostly addressed to me, defending his theory and saying my experiments and the conclusions drawn from them weren't true. I once planned to answer the abbé, and I even started writing a response. But I thought about how my writings described experiments that anyone could repeat and check, and if they couldn't be proven, then they couldn't be defended. Also, my observations were presented as ideas, not as absolute truths, so I wasn't obligated to defend them. And I realized that an argument between two people writing in different languages could drag on forever because of bad translations and misunderstandings. In fact, a lot of one of the Abbe's letters was based on a translation error. So I decided to let my papers speak for themselves. I figured it was better to use my free time from public duties to do new experiments rather than argue about old ones. Because of this, I never replied to M. Nolet, and I never regretted staying silent. My friend M. Leroy from the Royal Academy of Sciences defended me and proved him wrong. My book was translated into Italian, German, and Latin, and gradually scientists all over Europe started accepting my ideas over the Abbe's. So he lived to see himself as the last one who believed in his own theory, except for Monsieur B. from Paris, who was his direct student. What really made my book famous quickly and widely was the success of one of the experiments it suggested. Messieurs Dalibard and Delors did it at Marly, and they managed to draw lightning from the clouds. This got everyone's attention. Monsieur Delors, who had equipment for scientific experiments and taught that field, decided to repeat what he called the experiments, and after they were performed before the king and court, all the curious people in Paris rushed to see it. I won't make this story longer by describing that major experiment, or how incredibly happy I was when a similar one I did soon after with a kite in Philadelphia worked, because you can find both stories in books about electricity. When Dr. Wright, an English doctor, was in Paris, he wrote to a friend who was part of the Royal Society. He told him how highly my experiments were regarded by scholars overseas, and how surprised they were that my writings hadn't gotten much attention in England. Because of this, the Society decided to look again at the letters that had been read to them earlier. The famous Dr. Watson then put together a summary of my letters and everything else I had sent to England on the topic, and he even included some compliments about me. This summary was then published in their official papers, and some members of the Society in London, especially the very clever Mr. Canton, confirmed the experiment of drawing lightning from the clouds using a pointed rod. When they reported its success, they quickly made up for how they had previously ignored me. Without me even asking for it, they made me a member and voted to waive the usual fees, which would have been 25 guineas. And ever since then, they've sent me their official papers for free. They also gave me the Sir Godfrey Copley Gold Medal for 1753. When they presented it, the president, Lord Macclesfield, gave a very nice speech that honored me greatly.